welcome. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us here in the Norland Library at the University of Colorado Boulder and over Zoom from your homes throughout Boulder, throughout Colorado, the United States, and internationally. My name is Samira Mehta. I'm the academic director of the Post-Holocaust American Judaism Collection here at CU. This is a joint program, a joint Jewish Studies Symposium, bringing together two different corners of our Jewish Studies program, the Embodied Judaism program and the Israel-Palestine series. To start with the Israel-Palestine series, since 2015, we have been the home of North America's first endowed professorship in Israel-Palestine studies, held by Professor Hilary Kallisman, Jewish Studies and History. This professorship reimagines what it means to study the Middle East, builds bridges between academic fields, and fosters meaningful conversations with scholars, artists, and members of the public through annual public events. The Embodied Judaism program challenges the idea that Judaism is often considered a religion of the mind, defined by study and practice of Jewish law. It looks at the rich traditions of a religion that is also marked by embodiment, that engages sights, sounds, emotions, and feelings of spirituality. The Embodied Judaism series, held biannually here at the university, draws on materials housed in the post-Holocaust American Judaism collections to explore the role of the body in Jewish life through public symposiums featuring academic scholars, prominent practitioners, artistic performers, and multimedia exhibitions and exhibits aimed at academic and non-academic audiences. And we're really excited tonight to bring these two programs together. We'd also like to do some introductory and preliminary thank yous. There are so many more thank yous to come. We would like to thank the university libraries, the endowed professorship in Israel-Palestine Studies, and the David Schneer Fund for Community Programming, Public Scholarship, and the Arts. Tonight's program, Know Your Nosh, brings together scholars working on the significance of food for Jewish religious, cultural, national, and political identities, focusing on the United States and on Israel-Palestine. In our conversations, we will explore how food, so often seen as simply bringing people together, can be, in the end, far more complicated. Our conversation will begin with brief opening presentations from speakers, followed by a discussion of questions posed by moderators, myself, and Professor Kallisman. We will then have a Q&A session with all of you, our audience. We will be taking questions in two ways. If you are joining us in person, please raise your hand, and Angela Watts, Program Manager in Jewish Studies, will walk over with a microphone. If you are joining us via Zoom, put questions in the Q&A function, and Eli Sachs, Director of Jewish Studies, will pose those questions to the group. And now, allow me to introduce my colleague, my dear friend, and my co-moderator, Hilary Kallisman, Assistant Professor of History and Endowed Professor of Israel-Palestine Studies in the program of Jewish Studies.
Hello, everyone. I have the very happy job of briefly introducing our speakers today, although I would encourage you to read their bios on the website for this program in order to get more information about their fascinating work. So Ari Ariel, to my left, is Associate Professor of Instruction in History and International Studies and the Director of the International Studies program at the University of Iowa. His first book, Jewish-Muslim Relations and Migration from Yemen to Palestine in the late 19th and 20th centuries, from Brill in 2014, analyzes the impact of local, regional, and international events on ethnic relations in Yemen and on Yemeni Jewish migration patterns. He has published on the Hummus Wars and on Middle Eastern Jewish foodways and is the editor-in-chief of NY Food Story, the Journal of the Culinary Historians of New York. And so then skipping Ronald, who I will come back to, we have Adrienne Crone all the way at the end, who's Assistant Professor of Environmental Science and Sustainability and Religious Studies at Allegheny College. Her most recent publications include Growing Food, Ecological Ethics in the Jewish Community Farming Movement in Feasting and Fasting, The History and Ethics of Jewish Food from New York University Press in 2019, and Opening the Tent, Jewish Veganism as an Expression of an Ecological Form of Judaism in Jewish Veganism and Vegetarianism, published in 2019. So then here we have Ronald Ranta, who's a senior lecturer in politics and international relations at Kingston University in London, and he is a former professional chef. He is the co-editor of the Palgrave book series, Food and Identity in a Globalized World, and the co-editor of the recently published volume, Going Native, Settler Colonialism and Food, published by Palgrave in 2022. And last but not least, Nora Rubel is the Jane and Alan Batkin Professor in Jewish Studies and Chair of the Department of Religion and Classics at the University of Rochester. She is the author of Doubting the Devout, the Ultra-Orthodox in the Jewish American Imagination from Columbia University Press in 2009, co-editor of Religion, Food, and Eating in North America from 2014. Her current projects include Transparent, Queering the Jewish Family on TV, and Recipes for the Melting Pot, The Lives of the Settlement Cookbook. So now we're going to begin with a brief initial roundtable discussion where each panelist will reflect on the following questions for a few minutes. And the questions are basically, what do you study, and how does it address issues relating to food and Jewish identity? I think why don't we just go down the line, so you're in the hot seat.
Hello. So I study myself in a sense. Most of what I do is really kind of semi-autobiographical. And what I'm primarily interested in is Middle Eastern Jewish emigration out of the Arab world to Palestine and Israel, and then perhaps beyond that. So my work looks first at Yemeni Jewish identity in Yemen, and then Yemeni Jewish migration to Palestine. And my first book really focused on why that migration took place. There are a lot of very political narratives about this, and what I was really interested in is what are the global factors that made that migration likely? So things like new technologies of transportation and things like the opening of the Suez Canal, perhaps to some extent the entry of the Zionist movement into Yemen. And how did that lead to this migration movement that then led to most of the community from Yemen moving to Palestine and then Israel? And since then, what I've really been thinking about is how that move altered Yemeni identity, and particularly in terms of food, what that meant in terms of cultural practices, how a cuisine perhaps formed out of that, and how we might think about then both Yemeni identity and Israeli identity. So maybe an example would be helpful. I don't think there is a Yemeni food in Yemen. Right? Yemeni Jews in Yemen had local identities. They didn't think of themselves as being particularly Yemeni. They thought of themselves as being from the capital, Sana'a, or from villages, or perhaps regional kinds of identities. And with the move to Palestine, they then reformed their imaginations. They rethought about or reconstructed their identities so that they formed a single community that we now could call Yemeni Jews. And when they did that, they took all of their local regional foodways, put them together and repackaged them as Yemeni food, or Yemenite food maybe is more common in Israel. So the best example of that is there's a food called jahnun, which is essentially a rolled puff pastry kind of dough that is baked overnight for the whole night for the Sabbath, and then is eaten on Shabbat. That is a dish that is now the most famous or well-known Yemeni Jewish dish in Israel, and it is a dish that was only known by a very small group of Yemeni Jews around Aden, around the southern port, that most Jews in Yemen had never seen until they got to Aden or Israel, but somehow now it represents the community in a way. So there are lots of other examples like that, but how we have that reimagination, and now I'm wondering what that means in terms of how that community and then their foodway is reimagined again as those immigrants go from being regional to Yemeni, and then really to adopting an Israeli identity. Do their foods become Israeli? How do the different foods that they interact with get incorporated into their cuisine, and then perhaps a broader Israeli cuisine. Yeah, I will stop there.
Hi, my name is Ronald Ranter. I think first and foremost, I'm a food studies scholar. I'm a former chef. I love to cook. I love to eat. I love to look at food, understand where it comes from, who eats it, why they eat it, how they eat it. Over the last few years, I've focused specifically on issues of food and identity, and particularly food and national identity. In the context of this conversation, looking at Israel and to understand and see how and why food was used in the construction of Israeli identity. So if we think about the formation of the states, the ideas of early settlement, and the Eastern European Jew being transformed into this agricultural farmer, working the land, producing, bring the desert to blossom, the motifs of food in Israeli national symbols, more modern discussions of what is Israeli food, how it's constructed, who constructs it, and in that context, relations between Israelis and Palestinians, and looking at the relationship between what we now think of as Israeli food, this global phenomena of Israeli food, and the role and place Palestinians play in the creation of the Israeli food, and the role the Israelis play in understanding Palestinian farmers, Palestinian food, engaging in these really uncomfortable conversations and debate about cultural appropriation, the place and roles of Palestinian in Israeli culture, the place and role of the occupation, and discussions about Israeli culture, trying to find the kind of interesting discourses people use from both sides to understand their own identity and how that relates to food and how food is related to these identities and discourses.
Hi. It's funny to hear Ari say that he studies himself. And I think that it's funny because I don't study myself because I study what I wish I was, I guess, in some ways. And that's how I got to American Jewish experience. I don't have American Jewish parentage, and I think that sometimes it only takes about 5 minutes on the couch to figure out why people study the things that they do. I'm trained in American religion, and my areas of interest are race and immigration and ethnicity. And I think if you think about any of those things, food comes up a lot, just in the ways that people both sustain and create their identities. I think that, religion and food, the study of religion and food really kind of comes out of the study of lived religion, which is a way of, it's a form of looking, as opposed to top-down religious experience, which is looking primarily at texts and religious leaders, looking more at the people and how they practice. And one of the ways that I've become interested in that is by looking at cookbooks, which is like kind of a personal fascination with me that's become a pretty time-consuming and space consuming habit. So I'm primarily looking at the 20th century. My current book project, as was mentioned, is Recipes for the Melting Pot, The Lives of the Settlement Cookbook. It's about a cookbook that came out of a Milwaukee settlement house in the early 20th century, a cookbook that was a fundraising cookbook. I see someone nodding. You know this cookbook? Maybe? No? I don't know. And yes. And it was originally a fundraising pamphlet that was meant to help defray the costs of this kind of list of recipes for Eastern European girls who were learning how to become American in these cooking classes. And then it became this runaway bestseller. And now it's gone through 40 printings. It's the best-selling American fundraising cookbook in history, in the James Beard Hall of Fame, next to Fannie Farmer and The Joy of Cooking. And a lot of Jews look at it as this really nostalgic piece of material culture. But it was never kosher. And So there's this sort of irony in looking at this cookbook that was meant to teach Jewish women how to be American, that now, because of it being passed down as a traditional bridal gift, that a lot of times Jews look at it as something that was theirs and kind of central to their idea of what it means to have a domestic Jewish identity. So.
Okay. I also do not study myself, though there are certainly strains in my upbringing. I'm from the suburbs of Buffalo, New York. We always had a garden. We spent a lot of time at farm stands. This was not necessarily the norm in the 80s and 90s. And somehow that translated into an earlier project on religious food justice movements, and my current project, which is on the Jewish community farming movement, which is a network of the number changes annually as farms kind of come and go, but there's about 22, 23 right now, depending on who feels like being counted in particular moments. There's one here in Boulder at the Boulder JCC, Milk and Honey Farm. So this is a movement that has grown in the past couple decades, starting in 2004, as Jews were responding to the environmental crisis and the climate crisis, but also to changes in the food system that moved what's in the grocery stores towards processed food and towards other kinds of items that in many ways distanced people from where their food had come from. And so the Jewish community farming movement, which is not the first movement of Jews in agriculture, of course, there were movements in Europe and in Eastern Europe. There was a previous movement in the United States at the turn of the century. There's movements of kibbutzim in Palestine and Israel. And this contemporary movement is really focused on these justice issues, on what does it mean to be Jewish in the 21st century, to be connected to where our food comes from, to do something in the face of these crises that we are facing as a planet, really. And so the farms look very different, but they all have similar kind of primarily educational and community building goals of connecting Jewish people to food. And in many ways, through doing that, by connecting people back to thinking about the agricultural kind of milieu of the Hebrew Bible, of the Torah, where Jewish holidays were agricultural harvest festivals, where the cycles of the year were about what's being grown when and how things move, and thanking God for the food that was given to the people. So a lot of that is part of this movement of thinking about how Jews can, instead of kind of reinvent something totally new, reconnect to something that was previously central to the tradition in the face of a number of contemporary injustices.
Thank you so much. We're going to start, and I'm going to invite you to sort of not take this in order necessarily, but to sort of chime in as you have things to say and to feel free to respond to each other. So, it's not like everyone needs to take a turn. But to ask you, what would you say is the most surprising or intriguing development in Jewish food today? Can you provide us with some background on the development, like whatever your candidate for the most surprising thing is? Can you kind of give us its backstory and say more about why you find it yes, Nora?
We were just looking at these questions right before, and I was like, oh, I have one. So one of the things that I find interesting, particularly in America, is the rise of the high-end Jewish restaurant. So one of the things that marked American Jews in the earlier early to mid 20th century is deli culture, appetizing stores and deli. There were other immigrants that made sit-down restaurants, right? So for example, the Chinese had, kind of a spectrum of, fast and sit-down restaurants. Italians, for example, had really kind of fancier restaurants. And in the late 20th century, or mid to late 20th century, you see the rise of fine dining for kosher food. But that would be like a kosher steakhouse, a kosher French restaurant, not specifically what would seem Jewish. The thing that makes it Jewish is the people that eat there, right? As opposed to what we're starting to see now, and I think probably Ronald will talk a little bit about this maybe, but at least in the United States, we've seen the rise of Zahav, which is Michael Solomonov, all of Michael Solomonov's restaurants, right? Abe Fisher, Laser Wolf, and there are other restaurants in my town of Rochester. We also have kind of a Israeli-ish restaurant, but it's also very high-end. None of these are kosher, but they definitely play with the idea of Jewish, and particularly Abe Fisher in Philadelphia, which bills itself as this gastronomic tour of Ashkenaz, and so I have found that to be surprising. I think that was a thing that I don't think anyone really necessarily saw coming, because Jewish food was seen as casual, unless it was in your home, right? The sort of a Shabbat dinner type thing. But the connection of Jewish deli food, which is fast, and counter service, the shift to seeing Jewish food in restaurants was surprising to me.
I came up with something. Contrary to some of the things listed on my publications, I actually think it's relatively surprising that there is a growing movement in Jewish veganism and vegetarianism, given a tradition that honored eating meat on Shabbat and on holidays, that has all these prescriptions for how to process meat and when to eat meat and all of these kind of meat-eating traditions. I think it speaks to the kind of culture of the moment and the injustices in some of the food production systems, that we do have this growing movement of Jews saying, we're not going to eat any of that. And so I have studied these movements. I will just be upfront. I am a Jewish vegan myself, and I still think that it is surprising that is a kind of growing strain in the Jewish community.
Well, I guess it's building on Nora's points, and I guess I'll expand on it a bit later. The growth and success of what is now termed by some as Israeli restaurant, I find quite surprising. I lived in Israel as a teenager in the 1980s, and the food was not great.
It was terrible.
To think now of what Israeli food has become, or what is termed Israeli food has become, is quite astonishing. And to see its global success, and in many ways it connected to this point of veganism and vegetarianism and the whole health movement done in the food industry, I think it's quite, I guess in retrospect it makes sense, but seeing it happen was quite surprising.
Can I answer in the negative?
Yeah.
I mean, so in a way, I think it's surprising how quick it happened, but it is also really interesting. I'm not surprised because of the rise of, I guess, what I'll put as ethnic foods in quotes, that there is this model that was so easily adapted from the Israeli case. So I'm enjoying watching that grow, and maybe also surprised by how fast it's growing, but that's really exciting.
I think actually, segueing into another question, so could you guys speak a bit more to how Israeli food practices have shifted in recent years, particularly relating to the role of Arab Palestinian foods, food of Mizrahi Jews of North African or Middle Eastern descent? How have those sort of played into these shifts specifically with food in Israel?
Sure. I think maybe what's interesting is that to my mind at least, has been this growth of Mizrahi foods in what I guess we can call New Israeli cuisine, and that those are mirrored, I think, in Israel and in the US. So you have the same sort of expansion of high-end restaurants that maybe the reason the food wasn't good in the 80s, for example, is because you didn't have the kind of restaurant borrowing from the local cuisines and from local communities, putting them together in that fashion. Part of me wants to say that food was always there, right? So there were always Middle Eastern neighborhoods where there were places where you could get hummus and falafel and grilled meats and different kinds of bread. But those have now expanded out of those neighborhoods and have become a sort of general Israeli cuisine, which means that the Israeli public, sort of the middle-class Tel Aviv public, now has access to them, even though they weren't going to those neighborhoods. So I think it's expanded in Israel and then somehow is expanded out in this kind of interesting, rapid fashion. There's maybe an interesting question about whether that indicates a greater acceptance of the various ethnic groups in Israel. Maybe we'll come to that later. I'm not sure if that, right, that this may just be a sort of kinder face of multiculturalism, so that Middle Eastern foods are now acceptable, but Middle Eastern Jews maybe still are problematic in Israeli society. But either way, the food has certainly expanded.
I guess if you think historically about Israel and its relationship with culture, what is fascinating is if you look at early cookbooks in Israel-Palestine, there was an attempt to shift a European idea of food and nutrition using local ingredients. And almost a dissonance between the Ashkenazi elite and their ideas of culinary culture and what was actually eaten by, whether it's Mizrahi Jews or by Palestinians living in the land. Almost a rejection of those foods. Many of these cookbooks, you had Mizrahi food or Arab food relegated to the end of the cookbook as ethnic food or food of Jews. Whereas the ideas from Europe were hoped that these will be what the state will then take on. This will be Israeli culture. Many ways, if you read the writings of Theodor Herzl, the idea is what will create Vienna in the Middle East. What's interesting is how this was flipped on its head. All these Ashkenazi ideas were put aside. The very few Ashkenazi foods which are still prevalent in Israel are seen as Jewish foods. And that's not a mark of quality normally in Israel. Whereas Mizrahi food or Arab or Palestinian food, which initially was relegated over the last few decades, and you can see the slow transition, has been absorbed, almost glorified, and this has now become Israeli food. And some point at this, what this signifies in many ways is Israel being more at ease, or Jews in Israel being more at ease with a more Middle Eastern or Mediterranean, however you want to define it, identity, and also shifting from this idea of Israel being, in the words of the former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, a villa in the jungle, to Israel being actually maybe part of that jungle. Israel is part of a regional, cultural, societal environment which it rejected for a very long time, and now in a very odd way it's accepting and even celebrating to an extent, which raises a number of additional questions to it.
It does remind me of two particular movie scenes, which maybe would make this very clear. I'm thinking first of a scene in a movie called The House on Shlush Street, which is about an Egyptian family in Tel Aviv, where there is an accusation against the Egyptian Jews for, why are you guys always eating olives and all these other weird foods? But on the other hand, a movie called Casablanca comes to mind, which is kind of an Israeli West Side Story version of West Side Story, where the Moroccan character, the lead character in there, is very critical of how poor the Ashkenazi food is. And there's a scene that I use sometimes in teaching where he goes to his girlfriend's house and they serve him gefilte fish, and he's really, really thrown off by that and ends up like putting it under the table and giving it to the cat, right? So you could see sort of in that the rise of those foods and the sort of denigration of Ashkenazi food in probably an unfair way, has been built into this Israeli food scene, I think.
So zooming out from an exclusive focus on Israel, in your writings, many of you have explored the relationship between food on the one hand and social milieu, social change on the other. How should we think about that relationship? And how is or can food be a part of social change?
The Jewish community farming movement is in many ways grounded in social change and in efforts to reconnect Jews to the land so that they will both develop Jewish identities but also environmentalist identities. And so many of the Jewish community farms offer programs on Jewish holidays, but they also offer educational programs on the climate crisis, on injustice issues in the food system. Depending on the particular farms, these take different shapes. A lot of them are deeply embedded in local food justice movements. So they might focus on food security and growing food and making sure that people have access to it. There's a farm in Denver, Icar Farm, actually, that through the pandemic expanded how much they were growing to help with food insecurity as a result of the pandemic in Denver. And so there are efforts like that. And then there are efforts in other places. There's a project out of the Shalom Institute in Malibu, California, to employ differently abled adults who are often otherwise unemployed and pay them to grow spices and process spices. They dry them, they process them, and they sell them at farmers markets, which helps the community understand where spices come from, because it is a complicated process and you need climates like Malibu, California to grow things like that. And it also makes sure that people have access to employment who are often otherwise unable to access paid jobs. So this takes different shapes in different places, but social change is kind of embedded within a lot of these projects.
I don't particularly work in the realm of food justice and food security. I'm more of a lurker in sort of the changes that happen in the Jewish community over time. So one of the things that I like to do in looking at my many cookbooks is to see sort of what comes up over time and how that reflects changes in sort of what is important and what is valued in the Jewish community. So one of the things that I'm interested in is ritual and how certain rituals become more significant or less significant. And so I did some work at one point on the break fast after Yom Kippur, which a lot of my students particularly are surprised to find out is actually a relatively recent practice among American Jews. And so if you look at earlier American Jewish cookbooks, you'll see that there are no recipes for the break fast. There's always a recipe for what you're supposed to eat before Yom Kippur. But we are now in a period of very copious, heavy parties for that have, towers of bagels and lots of guests, and so this has become, which is sort of interesting to me because this is not a holiday about celebrating or feasting, right? It's a day about fasting, but so I've kind of looked at the ways that American Jews have created their own sort of holidays, and some of this has to do with wanting to make this into a holiday that is recognized by a lot of people. So if you're not celebrating the entire week of Sukkot, you may want something that would be a feast. So I'm interested in those kinds of issues.
And there's a very famous saying of "Tell me what you eat, and I'll tell you who you are." Mm-hmm. And I think if we think about food, it's one of the very few cultural elements which signifies almost everything about us in a way that other things don't. If we think about our class, our gender, religion, ethnicity, nationality, family background, our politics. So if we think if what we eat signifies all these things, then the changes in our eating pattern also have a resonance further afield. So if we think about social justice and changes, labor rights, the environment, immigration, acceptance of others, the choice of what we eat then has huge implications. So on the one hand, we can study the changes in society through looking at changes in food habits, whether it's through cookbooks, restaurant menus, popular dishes, what is seen as the national dish. But we can also take active, if you want, agency in the shaping of our society through our food eating, food growing, food shopping practices.
I guess as somebody who's focused on studying Mizrahi Jews, what I'm interested in terms of the social identity question is how, if there's this new Israeli cuisine, so that Middle Eastern Jewish dishes have now entered the mainstream and a larger Jewish population in Israel and abroad is eating these foods, does that signify that as Ronald mentioned earlier, Middle Eastern Jews come to Israel kind of as a marginalized community, and there's a lot of pressure on them to assimilate into European Jewish culture. So does this now signify a new kind of acceptance of Middle Eastern Jewish culture in Israel? And I'm not really sure. On one hand, that it's a really positive sign that there are these foods that are present and that allows for the possibility of different kinds of representations of Middle Eastern Jews. On the other hand, there remains a real gap in terms of the economic and housing and all these kinds of situations between European Jews and Middle Eastern Jews in Israel. So if that gap isn't closed, I'm not sure what to make of the appearance of these foods. So there's definitely some sort of shift there in Middle Eastern Jewish identity in Israel. I'm just not sure where it's going yet.
Yeah, I'm a little, so we were talking about this a lot today, and part of me is a little skeptical that about this, because I think of it in the American context and not specifically a Jewish context, but we have a lot of ethnic food in the United States that we love, and frequently, people who work in these restaurants will say, you love the food, but you don't love the people, right? So we see this in, Mexican food. We see this in the early 20th century, the love of Chinese food, still in the midst of all of these Asian exclusion acts. So I would love to see the glass is half full, but I'm suspect.
And I don't know, Ronald, if you can maybe talk about this also in the context of like Arab-Palestinian food sort of entering Israeli cuisine. And one of the things that Ronald writes about is actually, sort of Israeli, like Jewish Israeli chefs being more willing to talk about and acknowledge that foods are coming from sort of Arab and Palestinian traditions. I mean, do you see that as sort of a positive step?
I need to give a bit of background here. In the 20s and 30s in Palestine, there was some adoption and absorption of some Arab and Palestinian food elements, but it was quite marginal. It wasn't a major thing. And there was a willingness to even admit it. After the state was created, there was less willingness to admit that anything which is Israeli had anything to do with being Arab or Palestinian. And even though more and more food items and cultural items were being absorbed and appropriated, there was an unwillingness to accept it or admit it in any kind of way, or even engage in a debate whether this was happening and what it meant. What's interesting is over the last 2 decades, an interesting phenomenon has happened in Israel. There's a lot of elements behind it. I'm happy after in the Q&A to address it even further. Israeli chefs, Israeli food writers, you see it on the television, you read it in the newspapers, are willing either to admit that part of what we think of as Israeli food has an Arab or even in some extent a Palestinian connection or background or history. Some Israeli companies have taken this extreme of marketing their food as being Arab, famously hummus, as a mark of it being more authentic. So hummus is actually Arab. It's not an Israeli hummus, and therefore it means it's more authentic, it's better quality, and these are Israeli companies, Israeli Jewish companies saying this. We have more Arab contestants on Israeli versions of MasterChef, a winner of Israeli version of MasterChef. We have Israeli chefs who are openly saying, we have appropriated Palestinian food. What's happening in occupied territory is unacceptable. I work with Palestinian suppliers in Hebron and in Ramallah and in people, Bedouins in the Negev, and I'm using their food. Now, what this signifies is unclear. Not every chef is talking about it. Not everyone is admitting to the same thing. There's a whole debate of what these different things mean. An optimist or half full of the glass would say this is a first step for an Israeli society to acknowledge it lives side by side with another group of people and looking at its own relationship with this group of people, how they fit, what's the history, and even rethink their own identity. And there's something that the Palestinian writer Mahmoud Darwish wrote about, that if the Israeli Jew would look in the mirror, he would see that part of him is a Palestinian Arab. And there is a history there of a difficulty of looking at a Palestinian as either equal or as someone you share a land, an identity, a culture with. The half empty of the glass says, well, Israeli society is very comfortable in its position of power, and therefore it can take whatever it wants to from Arabs or Palestinian, and it can even admit it because it makes no difference, or even that food is non-political, and whatever you do in the food realm has no significance to any cultural, social, or political realms beyond it.
One of the phenomenon that has become increasingly prominent in the U.S. and elsewhere is the locavore. And, that's, of course, trying to consume only or primarily locally grown and produced food. What role does locavorism, if that's the correct term to be using, play in Jewish communal life today? How is that role similar or different in the U.S. on the one hand and in Israel-Palestine on the other?
It depends where you are in the U.S. In some places, locavorism is very possible. I used to live in North Carolina. You can grow almost year-round, and if you have a greenhouse, you're set. I currently live in northwest Pennsylvania, where you cannot grow for most of the year. There is snow on the ground right now. So I think in the Jewish community farming movement, which spans many different locales across the U.S., there's also a farm in Canada, they usually don't use the term locavorism and instead talk about knowing where your food is from and, when possible, buying local. Because for so many of the places in the U.S., if you're not in, California and some parts of the American South and Southwest, but Southwest is hard because of drought, then locavorism as a kind of practice is not possible. Even in the cases where you could eat produce locally grown year-round, even, prominent members of the locavore community often are getting grains and spices and coffee and tea and all of these things that we love that make our food taste delicious and keep us awake when we say move to different time zones and give presentations in the evening time. These are not grown here. And so to some extent, there is no such thing as a true locavore, given globalization and some of the things that we've become accustomed to having available to us.
I would link this a little bit to what you were talking about earlier with the rise in vegetarianism and veganism. So, and again, yes, it's impossible to really be a true locavore, and in many parts of the country, one can't even be partially a locavore. But I think there's been sort of an interesting move, and some of this is a shift from the kind of embrace of different types of Jewish eating in the late 80s and early 90s. All of a sudden, American Jews discovered Sephardic cuisine, right? And was like, this is so much better. It's colorful, it's healthier, not this brown Ashkenazi food and there's been a bit of a renaissance with this Ashkenazi food in the last decade or so. And so, for example, the authors of the Gefilte Manifesto, which is a great cookbook, by the way, is almost completely vegetarian. I mean, they make gefilte fish, but they emphasize, artisanal, small, sustainable fish catch. And but they point out, and this is sort of Adrian was saying, yes, we have a tradition of, having meat on holidays, and there are certain ways to slaughter meat. But Ashkenazi Jews in Europe did not have access to meat all that often. So they probably had meat on Shabbat. And for the most part, otherwise, they ate vegetables. And so there's been an attempt to kind of bring that back and say, we actually have a culture of vegetarianism. There was a famous vegetarian restaurant in Vilna in the early 20th century. They just translated and printed a copy of this called the Vilna Vegetarian. So it's not quite locavorism, but it is a return to sort of seasonal eating with an emphasis on preservation methods, right? So a lot of pickling, a lot of fermenting, and that's a way of using produce that's only available for a short period throughout the year.
I find this whole movement of wanting to eat more locally quite interesting, but also problematic in many ways. If we think about it, many communities, many countries could not be food self-sufficient even if they wanted to. So the idea of them only eating locally. And also, it's also interesting that it's happening, I think, in the context, maybe because of the rise of globalization and the kind of globalization of the food industry and the mechanization of the food industry, but it creates a lot of dissonance. So if I think about Israel-Palestine, the example I know probably best, on the one hand, there is a huge amount of celebration of the local terroir, authentic food, food grown in more traditional ways, more artisanal ways, and I'll say a bit more about it in a second. On the other hand, many of the foods we associate with the Middle East, if you think about hummus, for example, or falafel, chickpeas, tahini, sesame, pita bread, wheat, they don't produce those in sufficient quantities anywhere in the Middle East. Almost everything is imported. Even in Israel, this agricultural powerhouse, chickpeas come from India, sesame comes from Ethiopia. Another interesting thing about this movement towards celebrating terroir in Israel is many Zionist settlers came with European ideas about food, about culture, about culinary ideas and nutrition. Where do they get these ideas about what is the heritage, the history? They look towards what people on the ground are doing. What do they eat? And over the last few decades, there's been more and more interest of Israeli chefs looking at what Palestinians, whether in the West Bank, whether in Israel, what do they forage for? What are the things their wives and grandmothers cook? And there's been almost a celebration of the local produce that Palestinians eat, that Palestinians forage, and using it in Israeli restaurants, sometimes recognizing it as Palestinian, sometimes not, which is problematic in itself. And also, with this movement towards foraging, also brought a lot of legal complications in Israel. Many Israeli laws have been passed over the last few years to restrict Palestinian foraging, with the claim that many of these plants and flowers are endangered. So Palestinian chefs cannot go and forage for these things, but then they can go to the market and find people selling it openly in the market, or Israeli chefs openly using those ingredients in their restaurants. So this issue of localism is interesting, but raises a lot of kind of really complicated and difficult questions with it.
The only thing I might add to that is that although there are probably very good ethical and environmental reasons to eat local foods, the local food movement often comes with a kind of romantic idea of how people ate in the past that is simply not true. So like historically, foods have always moved from place to place and been transported over quite long distances. So it's just worth thinking about that as a way maybe to problematize the movement.
And so very briefly, food in both Israel and the United States has often been discussed in relation to a phenomenon called cultural appropriation. So how would you define this term? How do you see these questions playing out in Israel and or the US? And sort of how do these things fit together?
I'm happy to start, but
I think this is all you guys.
Okay.
we've had lots of conversations about this too.
So,
Yeah.
so even though I've written quite a lot about cultural appropriation, I'm not willing to define it. Yeah? I think it's a political minefield anywhere you go. And I think what's more important is the context behind it, rather than the strict definitions you use. So I've given an example to these to colleagues a few hours ago. There's many examples in the world in which one culture borrows ideas from another culture, but no one has an issue with it. And one of the examples I use in my writing is the idea of Japanese-style pasta. So Japanese are obsessed with pasta, regardless of how and when pasta was invented. That was a problem in and of itself. Japanese basically have adopted and appropriated Italian pasta, but have then bastardized it by using Japanese ingredients and addition. Miso paste, soy, smoked eel, bonito flakes. I'm not particularly happy with what the creation tastes like, but the Japanese love it. No one in Italy, to my knowledge, has had any problems with it. There have been no debates about cultural appropriation. And I think the reason is no one feels that they're being exploited. No one feels they've been marginalized. I think sometimes what's more important in these debates about cultural appropriation are the discourses behind it. And is anyone affected by it? So in the context of Israel-Palestine, I guess we could debate how particular dishes came about, who invented falafel, who does knafe belong to, how they came about. But I think that often is not the point. The point is how one group of people feel about their current situation, living under occupation, thinking about laws which marginalize them or separate them from the Jewish community. And therefore, when they feel that some of the food items they identify with very strongly are being used by another group, then questions of cultural appropriation are very interesting and very relevant. And the point is not whether it belongs to a group or not, but who uses it, how it's used, what is acknowledged. So now, I don't want to speak for Palestinians, but it's one thing for an Israeli chef to say, this is what Palestinians in Nablus cook, and I'm doing it as well. That's how they see it, or how they understand it. Another thing for Israeli chef to say, this is Israeli food. Yeah. Without any recognition, any discussion, or any acknowledgement of the history or the problematic politics behind those food items.
I very much want a definition. And this is part of, we had a friendly debate about this today, because I don't actually think that I know what we're talking about when we talk about cultural appropriation. And I say this partially because when I look at Twitter, although I deleted my account this week, but on social media, I often see accusations of, let's say, I'm making this up off the top of my head, it's probably not a great example, somebody using chopsticks to put up their hair as a kind of cultural appropriation, and I don't know if that's relevant or to the point. So I want certain sort of concrete factors to be met. I want a financial exploitation, and I want there to be an already existing conflict where one party feels marginalized, to your point, and maybe so much so that they feel like the taking of their culture by another group poses some sort of existential threat to the way they identify themselves. Right? And I haven't worked out an exact full definition, but I want to get towards there so I know exactly what we're talking about. On the other hand, I want to problematize that also because I'm uncomfortable a little bit with the idea of cultural appropriation implies that there's some sort of original or authentic thing that is then being taken by somebody else. And I'm not sure if that original or authentic exists at all, right? My inclination is to see every culture as already hybrid and already borrowing from other cultures. So I feel like cultural appropriation is really it's a problem, and it raises lots of interesting questions, but until I know exactly what it is, I'm not sure what to do with that. But we can talk about that more.
I would, just really quickly, I would say I find myself somewhere, I don't know. I don't know if I need a definition, but this leads me to think that cultural appropriation in many ways is sort of like the definition of pornography, which is, I know it when I see it, but that again leaves you in limbo, so you can't totally know. But yes, we had quite a long conversation about cultural appropriation, and we solved nothing today. Just so
For context for the audience, Professor Kallisman and I hosted the panelists for a working group in which they worked on, by and large, in-process writing today. So we've spent the entire day and dinner last night in conversation. So that's why we have these occasional references to ongoing debates about cultural appropriation in particular. But now I'm going to turn to you. And so I'm going to invite Professor Sachs to come up to the podium, where he is going to be the voice of the approximately 115 people who are joining us via Zoom. And for those of you in the room, please raise your hand. And Angela Watts, who is the program manager in Jewish Studies, has a microphone to bring to you.
Excellent. So what we're going to do is we're going to alternate. So I'm going to begin with one Zoom question, and then we're going to have one in-person question. So I'd ask you to kind of raise your hands once we're done with the first Zoom question, and then we'll kind of think together for a bit. And just to those online, the best way to submit questions is there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can put your question there. You can also put it in the chat, and I will do my best to faithfully represent the question you ask. The first question we have is one about the surprising developments that all of you mentioned. You all offered these wonderful, vivid examples of surprising developments in Jewish food, and all of them seem to be about Jewish food becoming more like the food of the non-Jewish neighbors among whom Jews are living, or the food practices or restaurant practices becoming more like the practices that Jews see in their broader society. And it's a sort of two-part question. The first is, are these just cases of assimilation, or is there anything else going on there? And the second question is, are there examples in a different direction where we see sort of surprising developments where Jewish food is becoming less like the food that's common in its non-Jewish environment?
I mean, Nora already mentioned this, but Jewish vegetarianism and veganism is, maybe veganism, but vegetarianism is certainly not absent from Jewish history. There's a long tradition of cooking vegetable dishes, of cooking non-meat dishes, often dairy dishes, most of the time. And so part of the growth in Jewish veganism and vegetarianism is there is something to fall back on. And there are still traditional Jewish foods that people can eat and enjoy with some or very little modification at all.
Well, then I think we will, unless anyone else wants to weigh in, we will turn to a question from the audience.
Hi. Sorry. Hi. My name is Roy, and I'm stretching it out because when you meet me or my wife, and I speak for a few sentences, you know immediately I'm from New York and I'm a Jew. And then people say to me, when we engage a little further, they say, well, do you belong to Orthodox? Are you Reform Jew? Are you conservative, Chabad, humanistic, whatever? And my answer is, I'm a bagel and lox Jew. And that's who I am. This food that I grew up with as an Ashkenazi Jew, and according to Ancestry.com, I'm 100% Ashkenazi. Not 99, but 100. This is who I am. And when we go back to New York, I have a suitcase filled with bagels. And it is who I am. I am proud of it, and I enjoy it. And I would love your feedback on that statement.
Yes. No, I think that's that identity as a bagel and lox Jew, as a Jew that identifies through food and through some of the cultural elements of Jewishness is more and more common. My students would be with you 100%. That is often the identity that they bring forward when I talk to them in class.
Yeah, actually, I'm laughing because someone did come to visit me recently in Rochester, and, there are different bagels, and people will fight over these, but someone came and was only there for a day, brought a rolly suitcase to go to their particular bagel shop and fill it up. But it's interesting because there's been sort of a history of kitchen Judaism, and sort of using that as both a source of pride and also as sort of an epithet. So in the 19th century, when Reform Judaism sort of did away with kashrut, they would say that the Orthodox Jews were practicing kitchen Judaism because they were, kind of nitpicking about food. So kitchen Judaism referred to Orthodox practitioners. And then in the 20th century, then Orthodox Jews started complaining about the Kugel Jews, who only, would express their Judaism only through knowing a good bagel, right? And so I just think there's kind of, an interesting history of the way Jews have expressed their Jewish identity through the food they eat or they don't eat.
One thing that comes to mind that also sort of answers the first Zoom question again is that there has also been this change in what counts in Jewish food, right? So in the 60s and 70s, all these Middle Eastern or Israeli or Palestinian foods enter the American Jewish mainstream. They have to be introduced, so you get all sorts of newspaper articles calling falafel like the Israeli taco or the Israeli hamburger or something so that they can be comprehensible to people. But it also strikes me now as maybe an example where that moves away from the sort of assimilated American food that Jews have started to adopt by then and becomes a way to re-ethnicize the American Jewish community. So maybe it's also an example to the Zoom question about sort of food providing a difference while it also is being Jewish food.
I was going to say, I'm not one of the panelists, but I would know, I taught for a year at Fairfield University in Fairfield, Connecticut. If you had a really good pitching arm, you could hit New York City with a baseball thrown in Fairfield, right? It's a Catholic school. It's a Jesuit institution. And I was trying to talk about religion and culture and identity. My students did not know that bagels were Jewish food, right? They've also so entered the American food world, often in, let's face it, regrettable forms. I was at a Dunkin' Donuts last weekend, not very good. But so there becomes this interesting piece also, that is where you root your Judaism. My Catholic students are not less dedicated to bagels. And so they just have no idea. They think it's breakfast food. They don't know that it's a historically, traditionally Jewish food. And so to me, that's also a really interesting piece of this.
I think we have time for a quick follow-up question.
Yes, that a lot of that's thanks to Lender's Bagels, who introduced bagels to the general population. But coming back to the Palestinian and Israeli joining together, our family's involved in something called Seeds for Peace, and it's and you're shaking your head. Yeah. And one of the ways that they find commonality is through food. And Seeds for Peace, for people that don't know it, is bringing Palestinian and American Jewish youth together in a summer camp in Maine. Thank you.
So we're going to turn now to another question online, then we'll turn to another in-person question. I just want to say that I feel deeply and profoundly seen and heard tonight. I went to music camp in Maine growing up, and I'm pretty sure the only reason anyone wanted to be friends with deeply and profoundly awkward teenage me was that they knew my parents would show up on visiting weekend with a car trunk full of bagels from New York. So I relate to this very strongly. So we've just talked about some examples where Jewish food kind of solidifies ethnic identities or becomes a space for solidifying either sort of historically constructed or new ethnic identities. One question we had online is whether there are cases where food has not only solidified Jewish ethnic identities, but really challenged them, complicated people's notions of what it means to be Jewish, either ethnically or religiously.
Well, I think one of the easiest examples for that has been the reintroduction of pork eating in Israel by Russian Jewish immigrants. And I think that raised an interesting, because they identified as Jew and as Israeli, but opening non-kosher places, non-kosher supermarkets opened on Shabbat in Israel, I think raised profound question of what does it mean to be Jew and what actually is Jewish food.
I'm going to, as they say, piggyback on the pork question.
Well done.
Thank you.
We're here all
Thank you.
night, folks.
I just came
We're
up with
waiting
it.
for that.
Yeah.
The borscht belt.
And talk about impossible pork, which, those of, I am also a Jewish vegan. Hello. But the Impossible Foods have introduced impossible pork. And the OU, the Orthodox Union, that is kind of one of the largest certifying bodies in the United States for certifying kosher supervision, has decided not to allow for a certification for impossible pork, despite the fact that the ingredients are pretty much indistinguishable really from impossible beef, or the impossible burger, or any of these other things. They have given certification to bacos, all kinds of turkey bacon, things that are called bacon. And there is a sense that pork, calling it pork, is beyond the pale. And that's been an interesting sort of argument of sort of what does it mean to be kosher, and who decides, and the business of it is very interesting, because a few years ago there was a very infamous raid at a kosher slaughterhouse in Iowa called Agri-Processors, and that led to where there were horrific. I mean, this is a Lubavitcher slaughterhouse that had been sort of investigated over the years for a variety of ills, treatment of workers, treatment of animals, and then it turned out that they also were, that had a lot of undocumented workers that they were exploiting. So at that time, there were a lot of Jews that kind of pushed for what they called an ethical hechsher. And so one of the things I find interesting is that the OU at that time said, that's not what kosher means. We understand it's okay to say, you know, these people behaved badly, but you're pushing for some sort of woke, you know, that wasn't the term that was used at the time, you know, but some sort of explanation of what kosher is. And kosher is, you know, these ingredients prepared this way, and that's kind of it. So kosher doesn't care about your feelings. Whereas now this impossible pork thing is all about feelings, right? And saying, well, it just doesn't feel right. So I find that to be sort of an interesting kind of challenge that we're dealing with right now.
And maybe I'll just add, speaking of not maybe feeling right, I've recently done a bunch of research into cultured meat, sometimes called lab meat, where you're kind of replicating cells in complicated machines to grow, in theory, a steak or a burger, or a chicken McNugget of some sort. And there are really complex and ongoing conversations in the OU, in other Jewish halachic circles about, is this meat, right? There's many questions. So, is this meat? Is it kosher? What would it need to be kosher? Does it, do the cells that you start with that are being duplicated need to come from a kosher animal? Or could this be pork, right? If it's, there's all these, principles in Jewish law about if something changes kind of fundamentally in process, and becomes something new, does it matter what the original substance was? And so, so far, the rulings are leaning towards the cells should come from a kosher animal, and so leaning in a rather conservative direction, but we could see that shift as well, and what we think of as meat might change quite a lot in the coming years.
We have a hand here.
Yeah, before I may say my question, I just want to point out it's a lot easier to hear if you speak into a microphone as opposed to thinking you're speaking into a microphone. Okay? Did I make my point? I mean, some of you are louder than others, some are quieter than others, and not all of us have perfect hearing. Okay. My comment is, or maybe more of a question, is in terms of cross-cultural examples of foods that are sometimes known to be cross-cultural and sometimes not, mysteriously, but they are the same. And I'll give two examples. I can give many. One is, in the German-speaking world, if you walk past a bakery shop or walk in, you will see a challah, many of them. They look exactly like chalot. They taste exactly like chalot, and they're called buttersoft. And I thought, where does challah come? You would think challah is the best example of something that's really Jewish, but it probably isn't. Okay? Now, sometimes this is known back and forth, and I'll give an example. I don't think I have it quite right, but my granddaughter, who's speaking German in Freiburg, Germany, walked into a store. We told her, buy a challah, and she knew. We told her the German was buttersoft, so she ordered buttersoft, and the person who served it said, yes, here's your challah. So sometimes it's known back and forth, and sometimes it isn't. The other example is, again, in Germany, we were served, we knew the chef at this hotel. He said, oh, this is something I'm sure you're going to love. And he served us a soup, right? And gave it its German name. And we looked at each other and said, this is exactly Kreplach. So we asked him, do you call this Kreplach? No, there's a German word for it. He never heard the word Kreplach. Okay? So this is sort of back and forth among different cultures without knowing it.
So would any of the panelists like to respond to this phenomenon? We'll hold off on your rebuttal to the stories that were told, but would any of the panelists like to reflect on this phenomenon?
You want to go down the falafel rabbit hole?
Nobody says about not knowing.
Oh, that's true. Well, we don't know either.
Nobody knows.
Nobody knows where falafel comes from, Ari.
Borders don't really contain food very well, right? So foods move and are shared all the time, and we just don't think about it most of the time. So we think about it when there's a particular conflict or when something arises. The example that I'd been thinking about earlier today was falafel, because we don't actually really know where falafel comes from, and there are all these potential theories for where it might come from. People tend to look toward Egypt. So one theory is that it is a really old Coptic fast food for non-meat eating days. On the other hand, other people say that's nonsense. It's not an old food at all. It's really, really new, and it's actually Indian fried vegetable fritters that the British, British officers, when they go from India to Egypt, start asking for these fritters, and somebody in Egypt says, oh, well, we could make these out of fava beans, and then falafel, or the Egyptian version, is born. But, there are other theories, but we really just don't know. So sometimes, these things are just shared among different groups, and we have there's no original we can point to.
So I think we have time for one or two more questions. So turning to a question online, and maybe sticking with the theme of maybe more sort of complicated, conflictual examples. One question we have is, can you think of any examples of culinary aspects within Jewish culture that did not originate in Jewish culture, but have nevertheless caused issues with other religions or cultures other than the hummus wars? Are there any examples you can think of sort of food that has become a part of Jewish culture, that didn't originate Jewish culture, that's been a site of contention, conflict between Jews on the one hand and non-Jewish communities on the other?
Well, I can think of many examples in the context of Israel-Palestine. I'm not sure Jews more widely than that.
Okay.
So over the last few decades, a number of Arab and Palestinian food items. One of the clearest example is a dish called knafe, which is a cheese pastry with kadaif noodles on top of it. There's a particular version done by Palestinians in the city of Nablus. It's called knafe Nablusiya. All of a sudden, over the last 2 decades, you start seeing it almost in every single Israeli cafe. Several Israeli restaurateurs have opened knafe cafes, doing knafe with Belgian chocolate and doing knafe with other sweet ingredients. With Palestinians particularly are upset about that because of all the examples you could find. This is one of the most clearest example of a Palestinian dish, which is now seen by many Israelis as Israeli. And there's things like malabi as a drink, which is seen by Israeli as Israeli. But actually these things are regional. Now, just to contextualize, this happens all across the world, everywhere. But I think because the context of Israel-Palestine, it particularly resonates.
I want to maybe take this someplace slightly different, which is that I'm not sure what Jewish culture is, which is just to say that throughout most of history, Jews ate basically the same food as the people around them, with some exceptions for perhaps holiday dishes or Shabbat dishes, right? So the general food culture has always been pretty much shared.
So we have time for one. We have time for one more in-person question. I apologize for going over here. I want to make sure we get questions from different parts of the room. We'll have time for one more online question, and then we will bring our evening to a close.
So my question's about authority structures and the evolution of tradition. And I'm building off of Anita's point at the beginning that the settlement cookbook is created, and this is my paraphrase of what I heard you say, as a way for Jewish immigrants to assimilate to American culture, and is not a kosher cookbook, and is now viewed by their descendants as an authentic expression of Judaism when it isn't even kosher. And I was trying to think of sort of contrasting debates. So in the Talmud, there is this debate between Hillel and Shammai about whether you light the menorah from the right or from the left. Around the Passover table, there is this debate about whether matzah balls should float or sink.
They should sink.
Which, as you
And we're bringing the evening to a close now that we've resolved that question.
And we're done.
Thank you, everyone.
And as you look forward and you think about the evolution of Judaism and Jewish traditions, which authority is more important, the kitchen or the Torah? How are they balanced, and how do you anticipate they move forward in the future, particularly in a world where fewer people are affiliated, the institutions are less responsive to the needs of the population at large?
Well, in the case of Hillel and Shammai, I'm not really a Talmudic scholar, but I'll play one this evening. I mean, when I talk to my students about the Talmud, and I say, well, who won, right? So what is it that we end up doing, right? And how did we decide this historically? And it's really who has the most followers, right? Like who supports that position. So I find the question of authority really, really interesting in terms of Jewish food. And before I moved to Rochester, I was I had a visiting position at Connecticut College, which is in New London, Connecticut. And a pretty popular cookbook came out of a sisterhood there called From Manna to Moose. It was a community cookbook. You know, the original was spiral bound, but I guess somebody knew someone at Dover Press, and they actually put out a cookbook that actually made it to my mother's Israeli kitchen, my Israeli mother's kitchen in North Carolina somehow. But so I interviewed some women who were on. It came out in 1969, and I got a chance to interview women who were still around who had been on the editorial board. And so I asked them, you know, how did you decide what went into this cookbook, and what were some of the challenges you had? Because there's always these funny stories, you know, when it's a bunch of people putting together and they don't want to offend anyone or whatever. They said the hardest thing was that we had to change a lot of recipes because they had butter in with meat. And I said, did it ever occur to you just leave those in? You know, I mean, this was this woman's recipe, right? Her name is on it, and you changed it? And she said, it's a conservative synagogue. We would never, ever, you know, publish recipes that weren't kosher. And I was like, oh, okay. And this is, you know, I get the same story from everyone that I meet. And I say, okay, so one more question. Percentage-wise, what do you think, how many people kept kosher at Bethel at that time? And then every single woman looked at me with horror. Nobody kept kosher. So there's just, I mean, I'm not sure I'm actually answering your question, but I do think that there's sort of an interesting thing about what we think authority is supposed to be and then what people actually do. So I don't know, that's my little tidbit for the evening.
Do I have time to?
Absolutely.
Around 1949, this Yemeni guy in Tel Aviv goes to the Ashkenazi rabbinate because he wants permission to import samna, which is clarified butter, from Yemen into Israel. And there's this whole debate that ensues between essentially the Ashkenazi rabbinate and Yemeni rabbis about whether this clarified butter, because it's cooked by non-Jews in Yemen, can possibly be kosher and then be allowed to import. And after a lot of debate, the Yemenis essentially say, well, we don't really care what your interpretation is. We've always eaten this thing. So for us, this is kosher. And the Ashkenazi rabbinate decides, all right, well, we decide it's kosher for you, but not for the rest of us. So, but in a sense, my takeaway from that is that the kitchen is always going to be interpreted Torah is always going to be interpreted in a way that makes the kitchen that you want to be kosher, right? So there's that give and take, but I go with the kitchen.
So I think we're actually at the end of our time together. I want to apologize for everyone in person whose question we didn't get to ask, everyone online whose questions we didn't get to ask. If you have questions that you would like answered, please feel free to email me or email cujewishstudies@colorado.edu. We'll try to get it to the right person. Let me now turn things over to my colleague, Professor Mehta, to offer a few words of closing.
I'm going to say this is very exciting. I thought you were going to stay here.
I'm going to stand right here.
Oh, okay, because I was all excited because we've been making jokes for 3 years about those Muppets. What are the Muppets' names?
Statler and Waldorf.
Right, and how
I'm assuming that's where you're
Yes.
going. Okay.
Right, and so we need to be here together to do the elderly crotchety Muppet thing. But except that we're not here, we're not going to be crotchety because this is the moment for thank yous. There are many, many people and organizations and institutions to thank the university libraries for so many things, for their support of the Embodied Judaism series, this one, the ones previous, for allowing us to use this space here in British and Irish studies, for their partnership throughout the years and into the future. We would like to thank the David Schneer Fund for community programming, public scholarship, and the arts, the CU Boulder Endowed Professorship in Israel-Palestine Studies, and the professor herself, the CU Boulder Department of Women and Gender Studies, who has been hosting the Works in Progress conversations all day today, and to all of the individual people who have made tonight possible. In the back of the room, running the microphones and the tech, the Zoom cameras, everything, are Dan Shosted and Jonathan Gall, who are our tech wizards. We're so glad to have them. Diana and Eyal Rivlin for the inspiring music that those of you zooming in heard at the beginning, and that we all actually heard because we played it here too. Their song Shalom from their album Coming Home. Greg Drinkwater, Associate Academic Director of the Post-Holocaust American Judaism Collection, who has been my conversation partner and partner in dreaming up this event. Professor Kallisman and I are so grateful for all that you have done to make this possible. To Maggie Rosenau and Angela Watts, who are both from the program in Jewish Studies. Their work has been central to making tonight happen. I was given a list of people to thank, and Eli Sachs, the Associate Professor of Religion and Director of Jewish Studies, never puts himself on the list. So I like getting to be the person to read the list, because then I can put him on. To every single one of you who came here to join us, who decided to register in advance to get a Zoom link to join us. Without you, there is no program possible. And of course, to all of the speakers who have traveled many miles through multiple time zones to be here with us tonight. And we hope that we have given you enough coffee to be happy, but not so much that you can't go to sleep. Thank you so very much to all of you.
So before we end, two final announcements. The first is that this is not our only program this year. We will have other programs as well. So on February 2nd, we will have our annual International Holocaust Remembrance Day speaker. This will be a talk about German resistance during the Holocaust. On March 15th, we will hopefully return to an in-person Schmoozapalooza concert. If you don't know what Schmoozapalooza is, it's exactly what it sounds like. All of the students in our Hebrew classes, as well as faculty, as well as some community members, perform Hebrew songs in front of other people. It's really fantastic. I hope to see many of you there. The week of March 20th, we will be welcoming our keynotes, our signature speaker for the spring, the Sondra Howard Bender Visiting Scholar, Professor Julia Watts-Belzer from Georgetown University, who will be speaking on climate change in Judaism. And as always, we're so grateful to have a partnership with the Center for Bioethics and Humanities at the Anschutz Center in the CU Medical Campus. We always have a program with them in April on bioethics, medicine, the Holocaust, and genocide. So I hope that you will attend those events. The final thing I want to say is just another word of gratitude. So this evening tonight was a bit of an experiment. This is actually our first return to public in-person programming since the pandemic. The last time we had a public in-person program was actually Schmoozapalooza, I believe on March 6th, 2020. You may be aware some stuff happened after that, and we decided that it was important to us to both make an in-person opportunity available for those for whom learning in person is transformative, and a Zoom learning opportunity available for those for whom online learning is crucial to accessibility. And I just want to thank all of you for participating in this experiment with us. We had a little over 20 people here in person. We had about 120 people on Zoom. We were able to get questions from both groups, and I want to thank all of you for joining with us in the difficult work of kind of rethinking what it means to build a genuine community of learning in this new world in which we find ourselves. Thank you all for coming. We look forward to seeing you at future events.
However, it is important to note that you may not be seeing Professor Sachs in this role. This is, I think, his last public event as the Director of Jewish Studies. And I would like to offer one final round of applause for his spectacular leadership.
Thank you to Professor Mehta, thank you to Professor Kallisman, thank you to our speakers, and thank you to all of you. The best part of being Director of Jewish Studies has been being able to learn, think, and grow with all of you. So thank you to all of you. Have a wonderful evening. Stay warm out there, stay safe, and we will see you again soon.